and welcome to Conversations with Khofana and Khofana Modise. Today we're talking about all things environment, and I'm joined by Adam Welz, environmentalist Adam Welz, and we're going to be talking about a very important conversation on climate change, biodiversity, etc. Adam Welz.
Yes.
I've been calling you Welz
Yes.
this whole time.
Welz.
Can
Yeah.
you tell us a bit of about the history of your surname?
Okay, so Welz,
fascinating.
my grandfather was from Austria. He came to South Africa in the 1930s, and I've traced the name. It's the archaic spelling of what's called a Welz catfish. Now, these are gigantic catfish. They get more than 3 meters long that live in the river Danube. And back in the Middle Ages, there are actually old images, old woodcut images of them eating babies, because women used to go down to the river to wash their clothes, and and they would have a newborn baby and put it next to the river, and then these fish would come out a little bit like crocodiles do nowadays and grab the babies and then go off. But there's an interesting story about conservation in there too, because for a long time people saw, like in, say, 100 years ago, people saw these old images and they said, there's no way these Welz catfish can actually eat humans. Because the Welz catfish, they knew, say, in the 1940s, 1950s, were only about this big and their mouths were only about that size. And then these fish started getting very rare, and the authorities then banned catching them, banned fishing for them to restore their numbers. And recently, because of the fishing ban, some of those fish have now grown very, very, very big again. And they've realized that actually those old images are real, because a lot of people thought, oh, there's no way they could eat, because they didn't realize, because they'd been overfished for so many centuries, and it's now only recently that they haven't overfished them and that they've grown back to those enormous sizes again. And now people realize they actually probably were baby eaters.
I don't know how to feel about that, but also somewhat inspired because coming from Botswana, I'm big on elephants and so on. And when you go deep into the north, you see all these large elephants, but when you're just getting into areas such as Maung and Erikon, they're not as big as we're in the wild. And so it just shows, again, the beauty of conservation. But out of curiosity, and not to talk about these baby eating fish.
Yes.
So these fish were not designed to eat humans.
No, not really.
So
they're just big sort of predatory scavenger fish. They'll eat anything that fits in their mouths, basically. So if you give them a nice little juicy baby lying right next to the river, I guess that's sort of a tempting target.
Let's talk about your career.
As grotesque as that sounds. Right.
Let's talk about your career, environmentalist. Why?
Okay. Well, no, I've always been interested in the wild world, in nature. But not in nature in the way that maybe a lot of people think about in terms of Africa, in terms of these like megafauna, like elephants, rhinoceroses, blah, blah, blah. For me, it was more the small things, because I grew up in a city. I grew up in Pretoria. And I grew up in the apartheid era in the 1980s, which was actually a very tense and terrible time in this country for a lot of ways. And I think I found, my family was very much not in line with the system, let's put it that way. And I found the sort of racist, very conservative Christianity, the whole vibe of the system as it was then was like very oppressive. And I realized I found kind of an escape from that in moving around the city as a teenager and finding all these abandoned plots, or walking right. Sometimes I walked all the way to the edge of the city and I walked through the veld, and I was fascinated by snakes and reptiles and frogs and birds and all these small things that you'd find in these places. And as I say, I've come to realize now that for me it was a liberation from living in this like very, very backward, very oppressive, very racist kind of society, which Pretoria certainly was in the 1980s. It was very much the nerve center, if you like, the administrative center of the apartheid system, and it was, socially, very, 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 very boring, to put it mildly. Yeah.
And so when you've been an environmentalist for how long now?
My whole life. What am I? I think I'm 51 now. Something like that.
And things have changed as we progress, and with digitization, and with industry and so on. So,
yes.
When you kind of compare, as we progress as countries, and the fourth world revolution, industrialization and so on.
Yeah.
My question then is, as we progress, especially within the African context, to what degree does it harm our environment?
Well, absolutely. I think that's a very good point, and we can talk about that for ages. I won't. I'll sort of get to. But yeah, there are certainly a lot of natural areas or places that used to be home to a lot of wild species that I knew as a teenager, whatever, that are gone. They've been destroyed. They're underneath new neighborhoods. They're underneath factories. Their new roads have been built. And you know, this continues. And certainly I would say, the natural world is a lot more impoverished in many areas than it was when I was a youngster. And I think there are a lot of threats we see, especially like freshwater ecosystem, let's say rivers and so on, are being extremely badly damaged, polluted, new dams, mining and so on. On the other hand, I think there's a lot more awareness of these things as well, and I think that's quite positive. And I also see huge potential, especially, and I think it's been realized in Southern Africa. I think we're pioneering this in Southern Africa in developing ways of conserving wild species, financing wild species conservation, for example, through ecotourism, through wildlife ranching, through all of these kinds of things. And none of these things is perfect. I think it's all very much a work in progress, let's put it this way. I think there's real pros and cons to things like ecotourism and wildlife ranching. But overall, I think it's very, very positive that people are starting to see the value in a lot of wild species and conserving wild species. So, and I certainly think many countries in Africa, Botswana, South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, have actually done a lot better of a job of conserving, especially their larger species, their megafauna, their large mammals, than say a lot of countries in Europe or in Asia, so on and so on. So it's a mixed bag, let's put it this way. But there's definitely a growing pressure on many aspects of the environment, and something that I think we need to do something about. And especially when it comes to this question of climate change or climate breakdown, and obviously we can we can talk about that a little more.
Is that what inspired you to write The End of Eden?
Yeah, so I've written this book, and the book is called, The End of Eden: Wild Nature in the Age of Climate Breakdown. And as I say to people, it does exactly what it says on the tin, in the sense that this is exactly what the book is about. We are going through globally a period of extraordinary change, of extraordinary environmental change because of climate change, or as I prefer to call it, as I say, climate breakdown. And I think, there's a lot of media about this in certain places and so on, but people tend to think of it as a human problem, and that's the way that it gets portrayed in the media, right? It's all about people. What does it mean for us? What's it going to do to our economies? What it's going to do to our agriculture? Blah 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 blah.
Etc.
That kind of thing. And it certainly is a problem for us. It's a very, very serious challenge for us. But, like I say, we share the planet with millions of other species, literally. There's all these wild species, all these plants, all these animals, insects, birds, whatever, you name it. And they are also being, very seriously affected by this. But we see very little of that in the media. And so this book really came out of my long-term sort of interest in wild species, but also my interest in climate change, something I've also been interested in a long time, and just sort of saying, hell, like, nobody's really done a book like this. That's really tries to, what the book tries to do is try to tell you stories that are real stories, that are based in science, but in a way that you, as the average smart person who's not necessarily a biologist or a scientist or that kind of thing, can read the book and walk away with an understanding of exactly how it works. You know, I want you to be able to say, gee, after I've read this book, I now understand how climate breakdown is affecting birds, say, in the Kalahari region and why you should care. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And so really I saw a gap, and I worked with a really good editor in New York, and it was first published in the US. It's now available worldwide, including in Southern Africa. And, you know, we really tried to make a book that was groundbreaking in that sense of there's nothing else really like it out there. And it's a tough book. I mean, I think the stories are tough. I think what's going on right now is tough. It's difficult for a lot of people to really comprehend. But what's really makes me happy and feel like the whole thing was the Sturm und Drang of making it, of making the book, the sort of the stress and the heartbreak that went into making the book was worthwhile. Is that a lot of people tell me that, gee whiz, you know, I read your book and I was a little scared to read it in the first place. A lot of people tell me that I was a little afraid of it. It seemed kind of tough and kind of depressing, sad, maybe. But now that I've read it, I feel weirdly invigorated. Like, it's kind of strange how many people have said that to me. Or I feel weirdly inspired. I don't really know why, but you know. And I think it is that sort of thing where it sounds cheesy, but you know, knowledge is actually empowering. When you understand something, even if it's something really tough and really difficult and really scary, it can energize you because, you know, you get it. It's not just this totally foreign, weird, you know, thing that's like lurking in the corner. Now it's something that I can grab hold of a little bit more. Yeah. You know what I mean? And so that is very much, that for me is really gratifying when people say that. I get these random emails from like all over the world, you know, like lawyer in like, you know, Colorado and, you know, some, you know, retired teacher in Australia and, you know, whatever. I get these random emails and people tell me this stuff and it's really great.
Yeah. And when you speak about these unseen casualties
that
are affected by climate change, do you think that in essence, you're kind of speaking to the selfishness of humanity? Because, you know, earlier when you were referring to how human beings are how's the climate change affecting us, etc., and we forget that we coexist with living creatures. From your plants to your animals to the very insect that's annoying you when you're sleeping. Mosquitoes. I wonder then, do you challenge us as readers to look within and say, this is what you can do, or just be aware, and be aware to what end?
Sure. I mean, there's so much to discuss there. Yes, I think the vast majority of people are nature blind, are unaware. And that is sort of difficult and sad in one way, because then they operate or they do things in a way that's very damaging to the other species. But there's another thing that I find sad about that is you folks are missing out on a heck of a lot. No, I know that sounds like a funny kind of thing, but I say to people, you know, it's like, look, I'm very into birds. That's one of my things. Look, I'm into just about anything that lives out there, right? I'm interested in all of this stuff. I call myself an old school naturalist. I'm always looking at it, trying to figure out its name. How does it fit into the ecosystem? You know, blah, 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 blah. Fun stuff about it. But birds is one of my things. And, you know, whenever I walk anywhere, I'm aware that birds could be around me. I'm listening for them. I see them. And, you know, I'll walk down the street in a big city and I'll see a bird of prey going past. And for me, it's like it enriches my day. It's like, you know, other people talk about the 3 dimensions of space. Well, I have an extra dimension in my life. Sounds cheesy, but it's true. I have all these cool things that are like around me all the time. And they are around you all the time too. It's just when you have that awareness of them, it sort of enriches everything. So like any kind of a walk anywhere for me is like extra because of that. And I think to a whole bunch of people, I was in New York a few years ago, and I was walking literally down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, right? So it's like super busy. There's like thousands of people everywhere. There's cabs and cars driving, and there's all these fancy, designer clothes shops, and it's a big shopping street. And there was a red-tailed hawk, which is a bird of prey, and it was flying about a meter off the ground, and it was literally sort of jinking like this, flying between the people that were walking along the street, because it was using them as a kind of a blind in order to catch a pigeon, on the corner. But what amazed me was that, there's this amazing bird of prey that's flying within, just an arm's reach of view. But all these people were like either on their phones or like obsessed with the fancy stuff that was in the shops, and hardly any of them, it must have flown past 100 people, hardly any of them saw this bird. And I just thought, wow, for me, that was like this amazing wildlife experience. Here's this bird of prey, killing a pigeon. That was pretty dramatic, and, blood and feathers flying and, all this kind of thing. And yet, here's all these people, and it happened right in front of them, and they hardly saw it. So I guess to your point, it's like, I think the first step is just be aware that you're missing a whole lot of cool stuff. And second of all, you can start becoming aware of that very easily, and you'll have something that'll stay with you your whole life. It doesn't have to be your only thing, but it'll be something that'll stay with you your whole life. And once you start becoming aware of these wild species around you and what they're doing and how they're behaving and how they're changing and how things are operating, then you'll start to see, like I say, how our impact on the environment is affecting these species and how our impact on the climate.
It is a natural for
Well, I mean, they're pretty adaptable, I guess, right? I mean, they're just, they've adapted to live in the city, but, what you'll see is there's other species that can't do that, and what you'll see is certain species are being forced out of areas because of droughts or floods or whatever. And because you're aware of that, what I'm saying to people is you don't have to believe anybody else about the impact of climate change. You'll start seeing it for yourself. Right? You don't have to say, oh, am I going to believe the scientist that's warning me about climate change, or am I going to believe some nutcase politician that says it isn't real? You don't have to. You'll see it for yourself. Once you start paying, and I see it for myself, I see that the species of birds that I see in Cape Town, I've lived in Cape Town on and off for almost 30 years now, and I see the birds changing and certain things in the climate are, things are getting much more unpredictable. We have much drier summers and much wetter winters, for example. And you'll see that when you start paying attention. And then what I say to people, for a lot of people that care about these things, it then becomes really difficult because you start, freaking out, to put it bluntly. And I think it's that sort of thing where it starts getting really difficult, and then you think, oh my God, I've got to do something about this, right? But a lot of people, I think, don't sit with the problem long enough.
What do you mean?
They kind of charge off into solutions mode too quickly because it's very painful, right? You see something painful, you see something difficult, and you think, oh geez, I've got to do something about this
now.
And yes, and it is urgent. That's all true, but you don't really sit with the problem because you don't want to feel the psychological pain, maybe the difficulty, and then a lot of people charge into doing these kind of like non-solutions, okay, that are actually often very like more damaging for the natural world, or and so I'll give you an example, right? So obviously, if we want to deal with climate breakdown is caused primarily by us burning fossil fuels, right? I mean, it's causing us burning petrol, oil, natural gas, coal. It's also caused by us damaging natural habitats or destroying natural habitats. So if we bulldoze a forest, for example, those trees that die, that releases carbon into the air. When we plow soil, that releases carbon into the air. So sort of land use and land transformation is also a very big source of the gases that are trapping this extra energy in the atmosphere and heating the atmosphere up, right? So another big source of it actually is nitrogen fertilizers, for example, which give off so we have these nitrous oxides that get given off into the air, which are also very good, like heat trapping gases. So there's a whole bunch of things we can do, and then we think, okay, well, we got to switch to solar power, right? Because that's not fossil fuels. Great idea. But what I'm seeing, for example, a lot of areas in Southern Africa, in the US, is instead of putting solar panels on our rooftops, which if you think about it is an area of natural habitat that's already been destroyed, right? People are going and bulldozing thousands of hectares of natural land to build these huge, solar farms or solar arrays and so on and so on. Yeah. So you see a lot of that in the US, especially, but increasingly here in Southern Africa. And, and there's various political reasons for that and so on. So it's easier for the power companies and the power utilities to monetize and profit from a big sort of solar farm that they've bulldozed a piece of wildland to build. It's more difficult for them to control the income if it's lots of people having solar panels on their rooftops, for example. So there's political and sort of financial reasons why these decisions tend to get made, in my view, in the wrong way, because I think if you're destroying a lot more nature in order to quote unquote save the planet, then you're not really solving the problem. You're actually making it worse. Another example of people like rushing off to try and solve the problem of climate change is they think, okay, well, trees, as they grow, they're taking carbon dioxide out of the air and they're turning that into their bodies, they're turning that into wood and leaves and what have you. That's a great way of getting carbon out of the atmosphere. So you get everybody rushing around wanting to plant huge numbers of trees. And I mean, you see these countries that get all the school kids a day off and let's go and everybody has to plant trees, and they try and plant trees, millions of trees, and it happens all over the world, and then they brag, we planted 120 million trees in 24 hours or whatever it is. And then you get billion tree projects, and then you even have now in the world, there's 2 different so-called trillion tree projects, and so you get people rushing around, planting trees left and right. Often they're planting the wrong trees in the wrong place, so they all die. Or they're destroying other types of natural habitat, like grasslands, which are actually very useful and very, there's a lot of species that rely on grasslands. There's even, a lot of, say in Botswana, people who keep cattle, need grasslands to graze their cattle. The next thing you know, suddenly some do-gooder has gone and planted 10,000 hectares of trees all over these areas that communities used to use for cattle grazing. And so that can also be a very big non-solution. I'm not saying nobody should ever plant trees. I think there is a role for tree planting, but you've got to do it very, very carefully in a considered kind of way. And that's why I'm saying sit with the problem, try and understand it, even if that's very, very painful. Before you rush off and try and, save the world. Yeah. And maybe in a way that's not particularly helpful. Yeah.
Earlier you spoke about how you refer to climate change as climate breakdown. And why is that? And what do you mean by climate breakdown?
Yeah. Okay, so climate, if we think about climate as a concept that we learn about in school or wherever we learn about it, it goes along with a bunch of other concepts that sit underneath it, subconsciously. There's this theory and there's a field of study called cognitive linguistics, right? It's how do we understand language? How do we respond to language? Folks who've really studied that. And there's a theory, among cognitive linguists called frame theory. And it says that every word or every concept that we have like that we have a word for actually sits kind of it's kind of the tip of a pyramid of a whole lot of other concepts that sit underneath it, usually. And we start learning these very basic concepts when we're very small, when we're kids. Like we're learning to walk, for example. And if we're learning to walk, we figure out, being up, like on our feet, that's a good thing. And when I trip and I fall on my face, bang, that's down, that's a bad thing, right? That hurts. And so, for example, then later on in life, we associate being up with being good and being down with being sort of painful. So like, if you're having a bad day, what do you say to your friends? You say, oh man, I'm feeling down, right? It's not that you're literally feeling physically down. It's that, but that concept of down was drilled into you when you fell on your face when you were a baby learning to walk, right? And so this concept of climate is related to a whole bunch of these concepts like constancy, like naturalness, like the natural order of the world, or how things should be, right? Like, so climate is this thing that's predictable. So you can say to somebody, oh, the climate in Gaborone in this season is like this, for example, or the climate in London in winter is like this. It's rainy and it's cold and it's, whatever. And this is kind of predictable. So climate is like a structure, right? To me, it's a structure in time and space. And when you pair the word climate, which goes with all these other ideas of structure and predictability, when you pair it with change, now change is exactly the opposite concept to all these things that climate sits on top of, right? It's exactly the opposite. And there's quite a few cognitive linguistics will tell you, well, that causes kind of a psychological conflict in your mind. They might call it a frame clash. And that's actually how our bullshit detectors often work subconsciously. Like, that feeling when you're listening to somebody talk and you're like, hey, there's something wrong. I don't exactly know, but I'm feeling there's something not right about what I'm hearing here. Yeah. So you have that when you put the term climate and change together. And cognitive linguists will tell you when you confront someone with a deep frame clash, they tend to reject the idea. They tend to get very aggressive maybe towards it. And they think not only is the idea bullshit, but you are a bullshitter too. So it kind of discredits the person who's saying it on a subconscious level for not everybody, for a lot of people. So that's a very long way of saying I prefer the time climate breakdown, because the word breakdown is more honest about the fact that climate is a structure. It addresses it better. And it's also, it tells us that there's this structure that we are in the process now of breaking down, much as you might break down a building or something like that. And you can't just stop doing what you're doing, and the building miraculously by itself puts it, itself back together again. It's not just like a little change. And if we stop throwing all this pollution in the atmosphere, then we'll change back. That's not how it works. It's like we're sitting in a situation right now, for example, where the polar ice sheets in the North and South Pole are melting. And the glaciers are melting all around the world. Now, these are very important parts of the climate system. If we stop emitting, fossil fuel gases and stop burning fossil fuels right now, those ice sheets are not just miraculously going to refreeze and sort themselves out again, right? This is kind of we're breaking this thing and we're transforming this thing. And I think this is the point that a lot of people really struggle with. By doing this, by transforming and breaking this very complicated system. I mean, the global climate system is very complicated. The global ecosystems that we all rely on, which are totally related to that, are very, very complicated. The more we break these systems, the more unpredictable they become. So we might be able to say to ourselves, oh, right, and you will see these predictions, right? You'll see these in scientific papers. As scientists try to understand climate change, which they have learned a lot about, they'll say, oh, right, if we continue emitting global warming gases at this level, we can expect the global temperature to go up by this many degrees, right? But they can make that sort of statement as a sort of very overall thing, but they can't tell you in detail what that's going to mean for this particular part of the world. Because what anybody who knows anything about complex systems will tell you, once you start destabilizing them, they start acting in totally unpredictable ways. They start doing stuff that no matter how well you've studied them or you think you understand them, they will start doing things to you that you really don't get, and that come out of left field, And I think that is the really hard thing when it comes to climate breakdown globally, it's like, I don't think politicians understand.
Yeah.
I don't think big business people understand that what we're inflicting on ourselves is not just breakdown of systems or change or transformation. We're inflicting on ourselves just this increased level of uncertainty and unpredictability. And that's, of course, very dangerous on the one hand, but it also demands that we radically change our thinking about a lot of stuff. Because thinking about uncertainty and unpredictability is hard. It's not something that our education system necessarily, sets us. Yeah. I mean, that's just one example of a small. I mean, in terms of what climate change is doing and what's coming down the track, that's small potatoes. And I think how do we start thinking about uncertainty and thinking of our way forward in uncertainty? And people sometimes say, oh yeah, so that's so much blah blah. And I say, okay, fine. You don't have to trust me. Think about who is it in our societies, who is it in our economies that understands risk and that thinks about risk on a daily basis? Well, it's the insurance industry. I mean, insurance people who run insurance companies, that's where they make their money. They make their money in understanding risk and correctly pricing risk, and they profit from their understanding of risk. Now, some of the people that have been warning the strongest about climate breakdown for the longest are the big insurance companies, right? They've been going on about it for 20 years. Not everybody has listened, but they take it very, very seriously, right? But what's happened, which is really interesting, much more recently, in the last year or two, is you're seeing very big insurance companies pulling out of major markets because they're just too risky to operate in anymore. And you can see this in the US, where whole states, very big insurance companies have started saying, you know what, we don't care where you live in California. In the past, they would say, okay, if you live like in a forest, then you're at risk of wildfire and whatever and whatever and whatever. And so we're going to charge you a much higher insurance premium than somebody who lives in the middle of a city because your house is at much more risk of being burned down. In the past, they might have done something like that, right? They would have priced in the risk. Now they're saying, you know what? Wildfires, which are getting way, 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 way worse in California in the last few years because of climate change, because everything's getting hotter. I mean, there's huge ones just exploded yesterday. There's 4 big new fires in California. They're saying, you know what, this places the whole state at risk because, if you have huge areas burning down, it has such big economic knock-on effects in the rest of the state and so on and so on. We're actually just not going to insure any houses in California anymore. We don't care where you live in California. We're leaving California. So you've seen insurance companies bailing out of California. You've seen them bailing out of Florida because of hurricane risk. You've seen them bailing out of Texas, again, also because of storm risk, hurricane risk, Alabama, places like that. And just earlier this year, there was a very small article in the newspaper I saw about Old Mutual, big South African insurance company. They were warning their investors saying, we don't think we're going to have, it was basically a sort of profit warning next year. In the coming year, we might see a decrease of our profits because we might see fewer people insuring their properties with us. Why? Because Old Mutual is starting to price climate risk into their policies now here in South Africa. And so basically what that's going to mean is a whole bunch of people's insurance premiums are going to go up, and they're going to look at that and they're going to say, okay, right, I'm not going to insure my place with Old Mutual anymore because they're too expensive. And Old Mutual was warning their folks because of this. So it's not just in the US, it's all around the world that we're getting to the point now where insurance companies have stopped warning about climate breakdown. They're actually acting on their calculations and their forecasts. And then the big question is then, once you start getting massive amounts of property that are effectively uninsurable, right? Well, that has a huge economic impact, right? Because then maybe I can't sell my house anymore because I can't insure it anymore. The buyer won't be able to insure it anymore. then my house is worth a tiny fraction of what I thought it was worth, right? Maybe I've got a bond or a mortgage at the bank for, I'm just making this up, 2 million rand, but actually my house is now only worth 500,000. So I'm actually owe the bank 4 times more than my house is actually worth. You know, multiply that on millions and millions of houses, and suddenly you're looking at something a bit like the 2008 financial collapse all over again. You know, so what I'm saying is we're getting to this point now where climate breakdown, if you're not paying attention to it, you're going to lose out in a big way. And I think there's this idea, oh, this is a problem for the future. This is a problem for the next generation. I often hear people saying, oh, this is a problem for the young people to sort out. You know, and you know, I'm like, well, I don't know. If you just, I'm not even asking you to care about wild species or the stability of natural ecosystems or anything like this, although that hurts us too, right? When these ecosystems collapse and we have droughts and then our crops fail and animals start dying. And, you know, as we've seen in large sections of Southern Africa now, that's a big deal. But, you know, we're sitting at this point where all you have to do is just pay attention to the short-term insurance industry. Jeez. That's all you have to do. And you'll see that this is something, you know, that you might want to take a whole lot more seriously than you thought you had to. You know. Yeah.
As you talked about how climate breakdown leads to this transformation of our climate. You also talk about new ecosystems.
Sure.
So is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is that a positive light to it, or is it a concerning thing? Because again, it speaks to the disruption that's unpredictable.
Right. Is it a good thing or it's a bad thing? It's just a thing. I don't know how to say. It's like
something.
I mean, right. So yeah. So what this means, right, is as this system starts becoming less predictable, as temperatures start going up in most places, or they are already. I mean, so that's going to start pushing certain species out of certain areas, right? And I write in my book about the yellow-billed hornbills, these well-known birds, actually in the Kalahari region, which is something of relevance to Botswanans. But you know what we're seeing now is a whole lot of birds. The world is just getting too hot for them, and they're not able to breed in these areas, and they're dying out of these areas, right? We're seeing trees or certain plants dying out of areas. Things are getting too hot or too dry or too wet, you know, or with hurricanes, for example, they're getting more and more intense, so you're getting much more, you know, destructive hurricanes hitting these ecosystems, transforming those as well. And so we're at a phase, we're at the beginning of what I like to call the great rearrangement, you know, where all sorts of things, species that you associate with being in certain areas and live in certain areas, they're not going to be there anymore, and a whole bunch of them are going extinct. They'll be gone forever across the world. Other species are moving, and so we're getting species living together that never lived together before. And they're creating these new ecosystems. And this is their response. And in one way, you could say it's a good thing because they're surviving and they're kind of doing what species have sort of always done in the whole history of life, which is they try to survive, so they move around, they try to evolve and so on and die and so on. But the thing, again, that I think a lot of people don't comprehend is how quickly we are actually, I mean, our lives are very short, right? Okay, we're a tiny little blip. Our lives, we think our lives are so important or whatever, but we're a tiny little, we live for this tiny little blip of time, right? And if we go back hundreds of millions of years in the history of life on Earth, and we look at the fossil record, which a lot of people have done, we can see that there are these episodes in deep history and deep time where loads of creatures have gone extinct pretty much all at once. There's mass extinction events, right? There's about 6 of them, depending on how you want to define them. There's about 6 or 7 really big ones and a whole bunch of smaller ones. Now, nearly always those mass extinctions have gone along with massive climate change, right? The dinosaurs were wiped out because a huge meteorite hit the Earth, and there was so much smoke in the atmosphere that it cooled everything down for years, radically, and basically it got too cold and they all died, right? That was a meteor coming in from outer space, hitting the Earth next to what is today Mexico, basically. And so that was a big, very rapid climate change. That was a strange one. A lot of the other mass extinctions have gone out also with very rapid climate change, like, for example, massive volcanic eruptions that have then triggered like enormous forest fires that have burned across like whole continents and dumped huge amounts of carbon dioxide in the air and caused, massive global heating like we're seeing right now. But when you go back and the scientists who look at these mass extinction events and they sort of say, okay, well, this is a rapid period of climate change and it wiped out, a huge percentage of the species on the Earth. What they mean by rapid is a change that took place across, say, 50,000 years or 100,000 years. I mean, it's volcanoes going on for 50,000 years, 100,000 years. That's rapid in the great scheme of time, right, in the whole of life. What people don't realize is our fossil fuel burning, and by burning fossil fuels, of course, we've managed to make all these machines like tractors and bulldozers and whatever, and the Industrial Revolution, which has allowed us to destroy more natural habitat and release yet more, heat-trapping gas in the atmosphere, make synthetic fertilizers, which have, trapped yet more energy in the atmosphere. All of this stuff we've done in 200 years, 250 years. We have already raised the percentage of energy trapping gas in the atmosphere higher than a lot of those, it rose up. We have already raised it about as high as some of those previous mass extinction events, but not over 50,000 years, in 200 years or 150 years. So what we're doing now is absolutely radical in the history of the planet. I think, and because our lives are so short, and because we don't have that perspective of deep time, we don't realize how radical it is. And in fact, it's happening so fast that it's like there's a delayed response even in the ecosystem. So we're not seeing it. It's happening so quickly that there are species that aren't even responding to the change quite yet, that we're not becoming aware of. So, and I think when you really kind of get that, it's pretty, as I say, it's pretty shocking. It's pretty life-transforming. And there's an American climate journalist, a guy called Jeff Goodell, and he wrote a few years ago, he said, he's also been looking at climate stuff for a long time. He said, like, everybody on the climate change beat has their oh shit moment. It's that moment where you're like, wow, where you just can't evade it anymore, where you can't get away from it anymore. And maybe, I feel like I've had more than one oh shit moment, but it's sort of, it's kind of transformative, honestly, and you realize that, I think maybe for me, one of my biggest sort of most memorable oh shit moments was a few years ago in Australia. I don't know if you remember, but they had those big black summer bushfires, they called them, right? Late 2019, early 2020, just before the whole COVID thing shut everything down. They had those massive, just epic bushfires. And those were a result of strange climate shifts, strange climate patterns over Antarctica, stopping rainfall, El Nino, and so on. It's a combination of things that really hadn't happened in history before. And Australia had dried out millions and millions of acres of Australia to a level that they'd never been dried out for before, And so you got these just biblical scale fires, just extraordinary fires burning millions of hectares at a time, and just burning these places to a toast. And I wanted to see the aftermath of that. So I drove across more than 3,000 kilometers of Australia looking at these various places. And at one point, I was in a national park called Kosciuszko National Park. It's not too far from Sydney, and it's a beautiful place. It's kind of high mountains, covered in forests, and it's lower elevations. It's a really famous place in Australia as the Great Snowy Mountains and so on. Anyway, this place had been turned to toast, by these just epic fires. And I drove up this sort of scenic road, and I stopped by the side of the road, and I got out, and for kilometers in every direction that I looked, it was just hundreds of thousands, probably millions of just burned trees. Like forests, everything was burned from one end of the horizon to the other. And it was burned with this thoroughness that I've never seen before. I always say, I'm not scared of fire. I'm used to fire. I've grown up in fire-prone ecosystems here in Cape Town. The fynbos burns, the savannas of Africa burn. This isn't a normal thing. This is part of the ecology. But I'd never seen a fire like this because it was so thorough. It had been so hot that it had burned all the organic matter out of the soil. There was no soil left on this forest floor, and it was like beach sand. And it had been like weeks since the fire had passed, and they'd had all this rain, and you'd think, it would be regrowing. Because, like in Botswana, right? Fire comes along, you get the rain, the green grass comes, everything sort of starts growing again. There was nothing really regrowing because there were no seeds left in the soil. They had also been burned. And so there were no birds singing, there were no insects. It was completely silent. It was absolutely silent in the middle of this national park. And that's when I really felt it was just like, wow, like I'm seeing something that there's nothing could prepare me for this. Yeah. Actually, I'm seeing something completely novel, like something that I couldn't really. You think you can imagine it, and then you sort of really see it, and it's not even like you thought you imagined it to be, And that's why I say I feel like I saw something completely new. I felt like I was standing in the future, in a sort of a unknown future, a brand new future, something like that, and I think, you speak to climate scientists, and a lot of them describe these kinds of moments or these kinds of feelings and these kinds of events. And, for some scientists, it's seeing data from a satellite that's telling them something that they never thought they would see, or it's experiencing a hurricane of such intensity, or, we've had several hurricanes in recent years now in the Caribbean that have gone from like a tiny little storm to a Category 5 hurricane in such short periods of time that a lot of hurricane people thought that it wouldn't be possible for them to intensify that fast. But they do it now, And so you have all these, I guess, these sort of moments, and that's also very weird. It's like it's almost like you.
I think I'm having mine now.
Yeah, it's like you're here, but you've been teleported somewhere that you, and to comprehend that, because you look around us and it's like, oh, well, the world is, in a way, it's still kind of the same as it was, but I've had this kind of experience, or I've experienced something that just has totally disoriented me, and I guess that's one of these sort of oh shit moments where it just feels so big and so powerful that you can't deny it anymore. There's no sense of that, and I think for a lot of folks, then it's kind of I think a lot of people go through very, very difficult psychological sort of times after that, and certainly I meet a lot of young people, especially in the United States when I'm there, who are very aware of this stuff, who feel very afraid for the future, and
they're sure burdened.
Yes, and I think also they feel very angry at the older generations. Yeah. It's like, you've left us with this, and now you expect us to figure this out and do all the work. So I get it, I do talks at universities and so on in the States. I'm actually doing more just next week. I'm going to Chicago. And you sense this kind of seething kind of rage, actually, in a lot of young people. And I don't think that that's well understood by the older generations.
Yeah.
Let's put it this way. And I think as the effects start becoming more and more obvious, as they will, this is at this point, this is only going in one direction.
Yeah.
We're going to see more and more of that rage from the younger generations feeling let down by the older generations. And I think some very forward-looking, a small number at the moment, but some very forward-looking older folks have comprehended that and are trying to put themselves on the front line of dealing with the climate issue.
Yeah.
But most still haven't. Most have this idea, that's up to the energetic young folks to figure this out, right? Yep. And I think we're, yeah. I don't think that attitude is going to get you very far in the future. And like I say, I think what we're seeing now, there's quite a few people who call themselves doomers around climate change, right? They literally call themselves that, and they're quite happy to call themselves that. They basically have this attitude that climate breakdown is so big and so scary and so far down the track that there's nothing we're really going to be able to do about it, and essentially our civilizations are going to collapse and everything's going to fall to pieces. And most doomers just have this attitude of, well, we're screwed and we're just kind of here for the show. Yeah. I'm not a doomer in that sense. But I'm also not one of these people who thinks, it's great. There's these technologies like electric cars or whatever, and we're going to be able to figure out how to operate without fossil fuels and it'll all be fine. I don't think that at all, because just about everything about the material wealth of, let's say, middle-class-ish people like you and me or whatever around the world, this is all fossil fuels, right? Pretty much. I mean, this steel was made with coal. This chair, this wood was cut with down in a plantation somewhere with a chainsaw that was running on gasoline, and then it was, So no, what I'm saying is, and there are people thinking like this, but you got to transform the whole material economy, right? Yeah. And that's a huge job. And I always say to folks, and then for a lot of people, that's too massive and it's too intimidating and it's too scary. And then again, they just put this climate thing back in this box and they try and carry on with their life watching their Netflix or, whatever it is. But what I say to people is the sort of positive flip side to that is, because you've got to change everything, there's something for everybody to do. Right? So then you just, again, flip the script. And it's not to say that everything will turn out fine. No, I think already some really difficult, tough, bad things are happening, and I think more difficult, tough things, bad things are going to happen. As I say, let's just talk about the drought in Southern Africa right now, along great parts of Southern Africa. As I say, as we move into more unpredictable territory, we have no idea how long these droughts are going to pan out for. And how are they going to break? Are they going to break with just truly colossal floods that then cause more damage? I mean, look at Mozambique in the last few years. It hasn't been much reported in the media, but they've been hit with huge flooding events that have killed a lot of people and really damaged their economy. And you look at these sorts of things, and you just it's pretty terrifying, but it's also not hopeless.
Yeah.
Do you know what I don't even like the word hope. Hope is kind of hoping and wishing and whatever. There's no hope. There's just reality in what's happening before you. I don't think it's worth going to kill yourself, for example. There are young people who sort of should I just go and hang myself up in the in my bedroom? I'm not saying that. I mean, but what I am saying is, the longer you sit with your head in the sand about the issue, the less you're prepared to deal with the difficult thinking and feeling that goes along with the more trouble you're going to be in. I think it's that simple. And so I'm not here to go, the normal format of a discussion is, oh, well, we discuss the difficult stuff, and then at the end we think of something happy, or like, here's the thing to like, get you. So I'm saying, I don't know if I can leave you with that, hey, but here's the solution. I'm not sitting here going, I'm saying it's hard, and you gotta figure out a way of dealing with the hard stuff and going through the hard stuff and sitting with the hard stuff, but don't just then. Besides anything, it's just hell of a boring to just give up like that. I find that rather dull. I don't like being around people that just give up like that. So, try and do something interesting about it. And I think there is like I say, there's a lot to do.
And a lot of people to do it.
Yes.
As well.
Yes.
Adam, listening to you is like being immersed in this horror environmental documentary, kind of wrapped up in comedic relief. And I just don't know what to do. But I am informed, and I think you've painted a really interesting picture of the state of our world today.
Yeah.
And what people are doing about it. And I think we need more people like you, and I'm glad there is some sort of comedic relief, because it's tough. I was just kind of like... It is.
It's very tough, and there's no getting around that. And I'm not, I'm not here to say, oh, there's this simple, I can just give you this pill to take to make it less tough.
The red pill.
Yeah, whichever pill you want. No, I mean, no, it doesn't work like that. But and sometimes, as I've said before, as people say, to me, they say to me, oh, geez, you're looking at your work is so, you're looking at all this depressing stuff, don't you get it? And yes, I do get very, very depressed and bleak about things at times. That's absolutely true. And it's like, well, how do you carry on? And I say, well, no, there's just some part of me is just intrinsically curious to see how things go down. And that's what I say. It's like, if the world is going to end, if there's going to be some like giant Armageddon apocalypse, if our civilizations are going to collapse, I want to be there to see it. I want to have the front row seat to that movie. You know what I'm saying? and it's like, so that's what I say to people. It's like, it might be horrible, but it's gonna be quite interesting too. So hang around.
You never know.
Don't give up. Stay for the end.
I could talk to you for hours on end. I'm so grateful that you made time for this, and I know I was pestering you.
Yeah.
And I'm glad it's a very necessary conversation. I'm so excited to get feedback from it. I'll share it with you, and I'm also excited to hear from all of you. And I'm sure I was a great host. No?
Yes, perfect, wonderful, poised, elegant, the whole thing.
All of that.
Yeah.
And thank you for being part of this journey. I'm Pafana Medisa, and I'll see you next time.